Hello, my name is Alma Zalecki, and I'm the Director of Academic Affairs here at the New School and the coordinator of the Food Studies curriculum here at the New School. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Food Studies program's panel discussion on James Beard, the quintessential American epicure. Before I introduce tonight's moderator, who will in turn introduce our panelists, I want to tell you a little bit about the Food Studies program and the Culinary Luminaries series, of which this event tonight is a part. As some of you may know, the New School Food Studies program just celebrated its first birthday. The New School had been offering a few culinary history courses for many years, but beginning with the spring 2008 semester, we began offering a full complement of courses in food history, culture, writing, business, and policy. Our aim with this new curriculum was to join the growing conversation on food production, distribution, quality, and taste. In addition to offering full semester courses, short courses on focus topics, one-day workshops for food professionals, the Food Studies program also hosts special events like this one every semester. Tonight's event is the third in our Culinary Luminaries series, following on Julia Child, Culinary Revolutionary, in summer 2008, and M.F.K. Fisher, Poet of the Appetites, in fall 2008. And I recognize some familiar faces from those two events here tonight. But if you missed them, both events were webcast and are available on the 4TV website that is listed on the page for tonight's event as well. We're finalizing our plans for this summer's Culinary Luminary event, so I encourage you to sign up for our catalog and our Food Studies newsletter, or watch the website for details as they are confirmed. And we hope that you will follow along with us as we move on in future semesters from the titans of the culinary world, like Julia, M.F.K., and James, to lesser known but equally fascinating and also influential pioneers in the American culinary landscape. And now, on to our discussion. The moderator of tonight's panel is culinary historian, food writer, and member of the New School's Food Studies faculty, Andrew Smith. Andy is a prolific writer and frequent contributor to academic journals and popular magazines. He's the author of 16 books, I think that's the accurate count for now, including Peanuts, The Illustrious History of the Goober Pea, The Tomato in America, The Turkey, A Social History, and most recently, Hamburger, A Global History. Hamburger is one of the first books in the delightful edible series published by Reaction Books, for which Andy is the series editor. Each one traces the history of a global food in about 150 pages, and if you haven't seen them yet, I strongly recommend them. They're really delicious little bites of culinary history filled with terrific photos, each on one particular food, and they're just a delight to read. Andy's also the author of the Encyclopedia of Junk Food and Fast Food.
It's a tough job.
And he's the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Companion to American Food and Drink. He has taught culinary history courses at the New School for 13 years and has moderated each of our Culinary Luminary panels to date. Please note that tonight's event is being webcast, so if this is not acceptable to you, now's the time to leave. But this also serves as a reminder to turn off your cell phones or to put them on their quiet mode. And when we get to the question and answer period, please come up to the microphone to ask your question. And now, please join me in welcoming Andy and the panelists.
I'm deeply honored to moderate this panel. There are a couple people on the panel I've been wanting to moderate for years. All right? We gave you a good bio on our short bio on each of the people. Trust me, if we gave you their full bio, you would have a large book in itself. My goal is to tell you something about them that is not in their bio, and I'm delighted to introduce our first panelist, Mitchell Davis. Mitchell is the vice president of the James Beard Foundation, is a cookbook author, and perhaps the most important thing is he completed his dissertation 5 days ago. He will be defending his dissertation in a few weeks, and all we can do is wish you the best. There are 3 of your committee members out there. I don't want to put any pressure on you, but that's it. Our second speaker will be Betty Fussell. Most of you, do all of you know the story of corn? you've all bought The Story of Corn, I'm sure. Her latest book is Raising Stakes. We do have copies of that back there? Question mark? Yes? We do happen to have copies back there. I have pressured Betty. It's been hard to do this, but she's agreed to autograph the copies if you happen to buy them. So it was very difficult to do that. Here's something new about Betty. She is writing a new book. The title of it is very provocative, Eating in Bed. That's great. Our third panelist is Dana Polan, who's a professor of cinema studies at New York University. He has the author of 8 books, of which the latest one came out 2 days ago. It's called The Sopranos. I don't know if there's any food in the Soprano book. There is. There was on the series, but so he had to have done that. He will have a new book coming out in about a year on the French chef, on Julia Child and that. He will be a third panelist. Our fourth panelist is one who has been here now 3 times. We dragooned her to come back again, Judith Jones. Judith Jones is vice president at Alfred A. Knopf. She is a prolific author in her own right. Her late husband wrote, in my opinion, the best biography of James Beard. And I've asked her whether she was willing to talk a little about that, and she said, try and stop me. So that's it. Her latest book, The 10th Muse, is on sale in the back. Is that correct? We could just happen to have a copy back there. And she, too, has been very difficult, but I pressured her into being willing to sit and autograph a few of the books if you wish to acquire them at the end. She, too, is working on a new book. The title of her new book is Pleasures of Cooking for One, which is a wonderful thing. Welcome, Judith. Our fourth panelist is Barbara Kafka. She is a prolific writer, and I think, do we have her Vegetable Love? We just happen to have her Vegetable Love book back there as well. And Barbara, too. It's been very difficult with these panelists, but she's more than willing to sit and autograph a book if you happen to get one. Barbara didn't mention this in the bio, but she was one of the founders of the Food Network. She may want to deny that, but trust me, she certainly was one of the early participants in it. Very, my history says founding, so that's my next book. She too is, I know this will shock all of you, she too is writing a book, and her next book that she's currently writing is The Intolerant Gourmet. Aren't those wonderful titles for new books that are coming out? Mitchell?
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming out to hear about James Beard. I work for an organization named for James Beard. It was an organization founded posthumously after he died in 1985, and I've been given the difficult assignment on a panel of people who knew him for many years and worked with him for many more to tell you who James Beard was. And in some ways I'm glad, because there's a lot to say about who James Beard was. In other ways, I say them knowing him. My relationship with James Beard began in 1993, which is a full 6 years after he died. What we say at the James Beard Foundation, and what I'd like to talk about briefly, is that James Beard was the father of American cuisine. You hear that a lot. We say it a lot. You'll see it on our literature. You'll see that resonate. Were you to Google father of American cuisine, I guarantee you James Beard would pop up. And I'd like to talk about that after I give you a little bit of a biographical information about him, because I think that there are some interesting that says some interesting things about him. And I also think that today and over the last few days, as I was going back into his own writing about what he was and what he thought his contribution was to American cuisine, or to American food, I should say, I think he said some very interesting things that even in our organization might come as a bit of a surprise. So Beard was born in 1903 in Portland, Oregon, and I emphasize that he was born on the West Coast because I think that informed a whole lot about him. He moved to New York after trying for a career in theater and giving up on a career in opera. He moved to New York in 1937 and intended to pursue a career in theater on Broadway, and in fact ended up deciding that there were not a lot of roles for a gentleman who was 6'4" and perhaps 300 and his weight ranged from 300 and something to more than that. And instead, in reading sort of his biography recently, he and a friend who had a passion for food that was developed from his mother, from his upbringing, from his family's cook in a boarding house who grew up with a great Chinese cook. He developed a passion for food that he met someone at a dinner party with whom he started a business. And it's funny to think of it today because they started a business called Hors d'oeuvres and Company, Hors d'oeuvres Inc., I should say. And his first book was Hors d'oeuvres and Canapés, which came out in 1941. Although Martha Stewart has written a fantastic book on hors d'oeuvres with all kinds of pretty pictures and all sorts of amazing theories about what goes together with what. And when I went back to read about the Beard's own writing about the founding of that book, he didn't really know. It's unlike today, where when you sit in a school in a school like this in the food studies department, and a lot of people want to go out and become a food person or have a food career or become have something to do in this world. He was doing that pretty much out of the blue, even despite having had an interesting upbringing surrounded by wonderful food. And he went on throughout his life. I mean, there are so many things to say, and I would read Evan Jones's biography, and I would read all sorts of amazing things written about him. He went on to have a career that included writing more than 22 cookbooks, almost 1,000 articles, many, many more thousand recipes, at a time that many of us today take for granted, when no one was really doing that, or very few people were really doing that. And few people were doing it as passionately and as informedly as James Beard. And one of the things that has always intrigued me is how did he know? You know, people in my generation who are in this food business think we just invented everything, or think the first sun-dried tomato fell out of the sky in 1986 or something and landed on a dish of pasta. And when you read Beard, and as I said, I've come to know him through reading about him and through meeting some people who knew him, what has always intrigued me was how did this person from Portland, Oregon, and born in 1903, come to know about an incredible world of food? And what you look at when you review the literature is for starters, he had an amazing memory. Everything written about James Beard refers to the fact that he never forgot a single thing he ate, and it appears to be true because of the detail that he goes into. He never forgot where he ate it, with whom he ate it, and how it was prepared. That is something that, as someone who writes about food and who can't remember what I had for breakfast, I find completely remarkable. And everybody found that remarkable, and some people will speak to that, I'm sure. But he also came, I think, and one of the contributions that I think he made was that Beard bridged a really important time. And I'm not a historian, I'll leave that to Andy and these other esteemed historians on the panel. But having grown up at a time before World War I, actually, before Prohibition and then before World War II, he bridged a time that we think America began in, a time of industrialized food, of processed eating, of not just the actual food, but the philosophy that quicker was better, that faster was better, that industrially made was better, which is only recently starting to change. And I think that because he was first and because his career spanned such an important period, right up until he's been considered the father of American cuisine, he was actually, because of his memory and because of his timing, he was able to bridge that taste gap between the people who were weaned on Gerber baby food and the people who had actually been grown up eating fresh oysters plucked from the beach, and the flavors of warm roasted, wood-burning roasted preserves that his mother would make over open fire and all that kind of stuff. And I think that is what served him so well. The question of American cuisine I find fascinating because James Beard was adamantly opposed to the idea of there being an American cuisine. Not just the idea of there being an American cuisine, but the desire to find one. And it's not as though he was cranky one day and spoke to an interviewer. When you go back to read his writing, he repeatedly said that he did not believe there was a new American cuisine, and that the point of it was stupid. In fact, he called it journalistic hype. And when you trace where that originates from, if you go back into a New York Times article in 1954, they called James Beard the Dean of American Cookery. And that's sort of the source, I think, of that soundbite that we misuse. I'm completely culpable in this. And I think that there's an interesting thing to think about between the difference between the Dean of American Cookery and the Father of American Cuisine. And I think it's an important one because I think it speaks to James Beard and who he was and how he approached food. Just to give you an idea that I'm not making this up, in 1984 he was profiled in a remarkable series of articles. It was amazing as I was rereading them for this. It was in Gourmet magazine. J. Jacobs wrote them. There must have been 20,000 words in 2 parts, something that would just never happen. There was no place to do something like that anymore unless you write. It would be a small book in a series of things about James Beard. And in that article, for that article, he told J. Jacobs, who asked about what he thought about this new American cuisine, he said, "French Nouvelle and American Nouvelle disgust me with their often outrageously illogical combinations of ingredients and their preciosity. They make me want to throw up." He's not kidding. This was printed in Gourmet. "And the idea of an international school of cooking is awful, a total mess. Nobody seems to know what they're talking about when the subjects come up. That issue," and he's referring to a well-known culinary magazine, "on American food was incredibly stupid. You know, I once was asked I saw my role in the whole picture of a new American cuisine, and I said loyal opposition." I think Betty's actually going to talk about Beard's voice, and I think that is part of his legacy and his enduring charm. So if he wasn't for an American cuisine, what was he for? And he wrote a lot about something that he called in an article an American approach to food. And in some of the work that I do, my doctoral work is on the evolution or the history of restaurant reviewing in America and the way that through reviews our tastes develop and change sort of collectively. And I think that the idea of an American approach to food is something that is, well, at least it resonates with what I think is happening even today in America. Certainly Beard was there first, and Beard did something. And a quote from Craig Claiborne, I think, is very telling. Craig said, he was simply the founding father of the national interest in good eating, the bedrock. He's been a real missionary throughout his career, and he has been the great force in developing the national palate. He's the most imposing figure in the food of field in America. This, again, was from the early 80s, just before he died. And I have 1 minute left. And I think that thinking about a type of American cookery, an American approach to food, to me, informs what happens when we go to a restaurant today. When you can sense somewhere that a place feels like it's from New York or feels like a West Coast restaurant, but you can't quite put your finger on it. It's sort of if people were asked to define Americans, which are a diverse lot, just as our cuisine is or our food is, I think that the words you use, and I did a little bit of research for this for my scholastic work, they're open, they're approachable, they're willing to try new things. There is a paradoxical, I'm talking about how people define American cuisine, there's a paradoxical relationship between not wanting anything to change and wanting everything to be new the next second. And I think that idea of an American approach to food, and of Beard being the father or the codifier of that American approach to food, helps me place him in the history of what's happening today, and I'll leave you with these people who know a lot more about other things to speak on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitchell. Our second panelist is Betty Fussell. Betty.
Well, as Mitch has made clear, timing is everything. And I would say that in the 50s, all of us were looking for the voice of America for obvious reasons that had to do with after the war. In 1949, this book came out, The Fireside Cookbook. My copy, obviously.
This is my copy.
there's the cleaner one. In 1949, I got married. I didn't know how to cook anything, and I was certainly typical of a whole lot of brides. I was given Better Homes and Gardens, and I knew that wasn't for me. That was very dull. And I bought the Fireside Cookbook because I'd already bought the Fireside book of folk songs. So, I like the pictures. It was illustrated. It was easy to look at. And it was my introduction to James Beard. And, I could cook some things in it because they were so simple. Okay. 10 years later, 1959. So this is the decade of the 50s. There came along the mass-marketed paperback James Beard Cookbook, which sold 500,000 copies. This is my copy. Missing the cover that had a great photograph of Jim behind a huge choucroute garni, right? I have no idea where that cover went to. It must be in my apartment somewhere. However, except for the first, I can get through this. There you go, thank you. 50 years later, I certainly use it, and because the foreword, the first words of the foreword, This is a basic cookbook. And he says, at the end of the foreword, you may grow old, even ugly, but if you are a good cook, people will always find the path to your door. I took that to heart. Now, there are two quotes that I think identified Jim. One, these are quotes from, the first is from Delights and Prejudices. It has always been my contention that the people of the Western European countries ate pretty dull food until the discovery of America. And the second quote that I love is, food is something you enjoy and have fun with, and if you don't, to hell with it. So, I think this is what Jim was the first to give us when we were looking for the voice of America and the food voice of America. Now, in the 40s, I divide food journalism into two parts. There was the home ec group and the gourmet group. So essentially, one was recipes and the other was restaurants. There was School Marm, Fatty Farmer on one side, and the La-di-da Lucius Beebe. Probably nobody here has read Lucius Beebe, but if you wanted to read about gourmet epicures, that would be Lucius Beebe. So we have kind of the pragmatic Yank style versus the European dandy tradition, as in Oscar Wilde. Now, what I love about Beard is that he really started out, I agree totally that his being a Westerner was essential to his character, as it was to M.F.K. Fisher, as it was to Julia Child, and as it was to me. But, you know, but he wanted to be, I think of him as a frontiersman, sort of a cowboy, Western cowboy, who wanted to be Oscar Wilde. He really wanted to be a dandy. The opera thing, he wanted to be, he came to New York to be in the theater. He wanted to be a showman, and that's what he was. That's what I identify him as. Rather than a writer, he was a performer, first of all. But he happened to come along at the right time in which he helped create a new audience and a new show. So he was aiming for, really where he came from, the middle point of the middle class, which is joined these two opposite groups of the home ec and the La-di-da Lucius Beebe. And he found this place. This was his new stage. And this is where he found a new food voice to talk about. Lifestyle, in effect. But he found it through food. And it's been going on ever since. Now, there were plenty of cookbook compendiums at the time, like Better Homes and Gardens and all the ladies' magazine stuff. There are hundreds of them, Red Book, Ladies' Home, etc. And there are plenty of gastronomies. The Gentleman's Companion, George Rector, Liebling, Bemelman, very European in orientation. And again, he was finding as his American voice. He wasn't looking to write literature. His writings were almost always collaborative. He always had somebody who was working with him, usually a woman. And I always think of all those mother substitutes all those years. Isabel Calvert, Helen Evans Brown, Josie Wilson. And I think of him as beginning life as the Eloise of the Gladstone Hotel off there in Portland, Oregon. And there was something about him that remained that. He was looking for a style of presentation, I think, when he came to New York, and that's what he happened to find in food. But his search was very American in that he was very successful in marrying commerce and culture. And as Rich points out, you know, industrial foods was just really beginning to take off after the war with the frozen foods, etc. Beard saw no contradiction between these, and he milked both sides of that cow. That's the wrong metaphor. But he did indeed tenderize, advertise Adolph's meat tenderizer, the frozen green beans where he was the jolly green giant. But all this was really part of the showbiz of the 50s as well as its economic base. Now, in Masters of American Cookery, I celebrated 4. That was James Beard, M.F.K. Fisher, Julia Child, and Craig Claiborne. But in the 60s, Julia and Craig walked through the doors that James Beard essentially opened. So I think or walked onto the stage that he lifted the curtain from. But all of those other people really began as writers, and then they used food as a subject, but particularly M.F.K., as we, was essentially premier writer. But I didn't encounter the literature of food through her. I encountered it through Elizabeth David, who in a way is closer to James Beard because it's straight talk, which James was terrific at. Elizabeth David does it with an English voice. James certainly did it with an American voice. He developed a style of American straight talk, which we didn't have that before then. It was both personal and impersonal, but I think it was, it's me talking to you. I can cook it, you can cook this, we do it together. This is the way he ran his cooking classes, which I was lucky enough to get in on some of, and it was straight cooking in that way. No nonsense, no la-di-das. Most important to me, thank you, personally, is that in 1972, he opened the doors to the hidden world of 19th century American cookbooks. And this was in the compendium he put together of American cookery. And nobody had done this at the time. And I was astonished by the riches that were there. To my generation, cooking began with, if you knew anything at all, it began with Fanny Farmer because you had those terrible home ec classes in the 8th grade, when you spent most of your time washing your hands to be sanitized. But here was the wealth of American history that we knew nothing about, and it happened to be in the form of cookbook. So I thought, I have great gratitude to Beard for doing that. And this was new to us. It's the first time I'd ever heard of Miss Eliza Leslie, as he called her, Maria Parloa, Mary Randolph. Opening the possibilities of American food history, this was a big moment. And this is before, really, Julia had come in. She opened the French world, but Jim, in this way, opened the American world. By the 70s, what I think of as a food revolution had succeeded so well that it could rebel in turn from the marriage of the food industry with food journalism. And so we get people like the Hesses, Karen and John, who took all these other people to task viciously for being too commercial and for endorsing Omaha steaks and that kind of thing. And they were much more purist. That's really a return to purism. James Beard was not a purist. And meanwhile, Jim had helped to break food writing loose from fine writing. That was an enormous thing. So from the tradition of elegance, the Oscar Wilde tradition, he got his own voice out there on behalf of plain speaking, which is an American thing. Right. And he is known and remembered in symposiums like this one for what he embodied literally in the flesh, or in the image of that flesh. And he became his own brand. As Julia did through television, he did through books, so that Fireside Cookbook became the James Beard Fireside Cookbook, and all of his books had his name on it. So he was the first food guy to become his own brand. So it's back to the simple pleasures of simple ingredients, where food is a comfort because it is always fun. And if it isn't, to hell with it.
Our third panelist is Dana Polan. Dana.
Thank you. I'm primarily a food and media scholar with a side interest in food studies. And as Andy said, as a way of combining those interests, film and television and food studies, I've been writing a book on Julia Child's French Chef TV show, and specifically writing about it as a TV show. And during the time I was writing it, friends and colleagues would often come to me and say two things. They'd say, what a great idea for a book. And then they'd say, and Julia Child had the very first TV cooking show, didn't she? And the answer is, in fact, no, there were many cooking shows before Julia Child. For example, through the 1950s, and there's a very interesting book by William Kaufman from 1955 called Cooking with the Experts. Through the 1950s, for example, and this connects up to Betty's distinction between the home economic, home ec courses, home ec teachers, home ec foodies, and the la-di-da tradition. For example, through the 1950s, there were dozens of shows on local television, daytime shows, often taught by women, generally women with a background in home economics, who took as their task to instruct young women, primarily, young women of the time, in the means to make typical American fare economically, expeditiously, and in healthy style. Now, the daytime home economic TV cooking show is not the only form that proliferates in the period before Julia Child. And what I want to do is talk about the example of James Beard. James Beard, I'm pretty confident in saying this, had the first standalone TV cooking show in America. I also think it's interesting that he was very integral to another form of the cooking show that I want to also talk about. And I say the standalone cooking show because there's primarily two kinds of cooking shows in America in the post-war period. The two types are not ideal or pure, and they sometimes blur. One is what we might call a magazine show. And a magazine show will be generally a half-an-hour show. The equivalent today would be something like Good Morning America. And it'll be divided up into segments, usually about 10 minutes each. And in the 40s and 50s, there were a number of these shows. Again, most of them daytime. And the idea was the primary targeted audience was women. It was going to give them household hints, some entertainment along the way, but primarily household hints. And because it was women, they might be doing other things. They might have to go out of the room to check on something, go get the clothes out of the dryer. So they could miss a 10-minute segment, but then there'd be another segment to come along and give them, again, useful information. One of the most famous, and it's actually the first TV series by NBC in the post-war period, is a show called Radio City Matinee, which had been on in 1941. It then went off the air during the war, comes back in 1946 as a daytime show and has a cooking segment with George Rector from Rector's Restaurant. Someone mentioned that. And it's interesting, the Library of Congress has the audio of one of George Rector's episodes for Radio City Matinee, and he talks about camembert cheese, how he seduced his wife by serving camembert with pear at their first date. So you see that sort of post-war discovery of Frenchness. The standalone cooking show is a show where from beginning to end, cooking is the subject. It might be a 15-minute show. It might be a half-an-hour show. And as I say, the boundaries between the magazine show and the standalone show can blur. You might have a half-hour cooking show that would include segments on other things. So, for example, on this I would love to find if there's any material out there. I don't think there is. Ernie Kovacs, the famous TV serialist, had 2 daytime cooking shows, which were magazine shows that Ernie would do sketches, do crazy things, and cook. And there'd be singers, there'd be dancers. There seems to be no available information about the show. Now, it's long been known that James Beard had the first standalone cooking show, I Love to Eat, which is in 1946. And little is known about it. And little is known about a magazine show that he's known to have been in before I Love to Eat, namely a show called For You and Yours. And if you read one of the biographies of James Beard, the Robert Clark biography, he even goes so far as to say, all we know about James Beard's TV work in the 1940s is one single index card at NBC that has the name of a show. In fact, there's more information available, and what I want to talk about very briefly, and you'll tell me when I turn this up. What I want to talk about very briefly is the discovery of the audio for 4 James Beard shows that are at the Library of Congress. And I owe the discovery to another person, a man named Robert Sagawat, and I just want to mention that. Robert Sagawat is not interested in food at all. He's a hobbyist interested in early TV shows. And doing work on early TV shows, he discovered that in the recorded sound division of the Library of Congress, not the motion picture moving image division, but recorded sound, there is the audio for one of George Rector's episodes of Radio City Matinee, and then there's 4 James Beard audios. And no one knew about this because it's in recorded sound, and they have a separate catalog, and separate from the Library of Congress catalog, separated from the motion picture catalog. So no one was talking to anybody. Sagawat discovered this, and I've been going to the Library of Congress and listening to this material. And it's hard to listen to a TV show because you're only getting the audio. Well, that's what I want to talk about, the audio for these shows. And the research includes, I think, several discoveries. One is, if you read this, any number of standard studies of Beard, they'll mention that he was on For You and Yours and then do I Love to Eat. In fact, he was also on Radio City Matinee, the first magazine show. George Rector did it as a daytime show. At some point in 1946, NBC decided to market it as an evening show, even though it's called Radio City Matinee. And they do it for several weeks as an evening show with James Beard instead of George Rector. And at least one of the episodes of The Beard is of Radio City Matinee. He does it as an evening show, and then they decide Radio City Matinee would be better as daytime. but Beard wants to do an evening show. Let's give him his own evening show. And that's eventually becomes I Love to Eat. Now, this is in 1946, 1947. He doesn't have a long career on television at the time. As other people mentioned, he has 3 books by then. And just to give you some context for the TV work, I gave you the handout. There's a page from the Fallon game Cookery. And I'll just go through this very, very quickly, read it at your leisure. But it's just to remind you of some of the qualities of writing and cooking instruction we associate with James Beard. And some of this has been mentioned by the other panelists. There's an emphasis on a kind of direct cooking. He talks about cooking chicken as a quick and easy process. His recipes are given in narrative style, and in other pages of the book, it'll be as a narrative rather than steps. There's an emphasis on a good American fare, whether we want to call it American cookery or American cuisine. There's almost a kind of interest in regional cuisine, local foods, food of the American terroir in a certain sense. There's also an emphasis, and this has been alluded to, and I think we'll come back to this, on the role of memory. Beard is very much about food as memory. He'll remember the meals he had, and he'll then give narratives of his memory of a food. I'll remember when I ate my onion the first time, or the jellied chicken soup I had. And here you get on the second page his memory of his dad cooking chicken. So that's the kind of pedagogy that Beard is representing in 1946. The Fowl and Game Cookery comes out in 1944. How am I doing on time? 2 minutes. Okay. I'm going to tell you about the TV show in 2 minutes. There are 4 episodes that exist of James Beard TV work. 1 Radio City matinee, 1 episode of For You and Yours, 2 episodes of For I Love to Eat. And in order, they present the following topics: grilled striped bass, grilled herb chicken, pancakes and ham steak, and fruit desserts. And they all have certain qualities to them. They all give basic cooking explained in somewhat pragmatic style. Here's what I'm going to cook, here's how to do it. Although they're non-chronological. He'll have prepared certain things and he'll say, and now let me show you the chicken that's already in the oven. So it doesn't go in forward-moving sequence, and there's almost a kind of cross-cutting. There's nothing too daring. It's sort of common American fare. And there's, for me, a great moment, because I live on Bleecker Street, where he says, do your striped bass with olive oil, and you can find olive oil in strange nooks, like under the Brooklyn Bridge or on Bleecker Street. There are incredibly corny jokes. So, for example, in the herb chicken episode, he talks about stuffing herbs under the skin of chickens and says, it's called Chicken I've Got You Under My Skin. It was... Once NBC realized what they had with Beard, they very much saw it as an evening show. And this is a period where TV is not sure should it be a popular culture form for women, for the general public. When they give him the show For You and Yours, it's explained by the announcer, the title is to mean for the whole family, not just for women. And Beard, who I think is often very responsive to sponsors and to whoever is promoting his work, is very good in the episodes of For You and Yours and I Love to Eat at sort of doing what he's supposed to do for the format of the show. So For You and Yours, he keeps talking about men, and he'll say, I'm going to give a recipe, and this is for men. And when you stuff the chicken, do it with your fingers. Women don't like to do that, but this is a recipe for men. And when you decorate the chicken, don't put too much on it, because women are not the best decorators. It's interesting when you know something about his sexual identity. He says, men always make the best decorators. Another aspect of the shows is, especially I Love to Eat, which was, Borden was the sponsor, is how much product placement there is. And Beard was someone always willing, not always, but often willing to do product placement. And the product placement is incredibly present in I Love to Eat, and I think incredibly awkward. And he'll do things like at one point he's giving a peach Melba recipe, and he says, peach Melba you make with ice cream. If only Madame Melba had had Borden's available to her. And I should mention, I love the other 2 shows, Radio City Matinee and For You and Yours, are non-fictional shows. He simply says, here's the recipe. I Love to Eat has fictional premises. In one, he's supposed to be in a ski chalet when Gloria and Ray come back. They've been out skiing, and they say, we're hungry, Jim. What are you going to make for us? In the other episode, he's preparing a buffet dinner for the hurry-up crowd. And he says, I've got to hurry up. And his delivery man comes in and answers the phone, and the phone call is from Elmer the cow, Elsie's boyfriend, who says, I've got all these ideas how to promote Borden ice cream. And they should do a juggling act with all of Borden's products is one idea. They should have a parade of Borden products. And Beard goes, oh, no, not that. And you see his acting style, which is very theatrical. He enunciates everything, but it's, oh, no, we would never tolerate that, Elsie. Oh, my gosh, I can't believe it. Why did the show go off? Maybe I've just given an answer. It's not, although I think in 1946, 1947, TV is so much in its beginnings, quality is not really the important issue. It's more the reach of shows. It's estimated that about 800 homes are watching a show like I Love to Eat, or can receive I Love to Eat in that period. There are confusions in the period over what TV should be doing. It's not until, in fact, 1947 that NBC even has a branch that's concerned with product development and show development. And in fact, in 1948, the FCC puts a freeze on licenses for new television stations that last till 1952. So it's clearly a moment where TV is not going to develop. No one knows where it should develop. And I think it's likely that Borden simply said, we don't know where this show is going, and pulls its sponsorship. So we could talk more about this. I should apologize. I asked NBC for permission to play some of this, and I had the fastest reply from a corporation I've ever gotten in all my research. Like immediately they said, no, our shows are only available for license purposes. And I wanted to say, but I discovered this show, you wouldn't have known about it. And then I said, could I license it? And they said, that's not what we mean by licensing. So I apologize for that. But I did want to give you some view of what the show was like.
Our fourth panelist is Judith Jones. Judith?
I just want to tell you a little bit about what it was like to work with James Beard, because I think it reveals so much what made him special. I first encountered him not until 1961, and that was the fall when we were bringing out this huge tome by an American woman and two French women called Mastering the Art of French Cooking. And I didn't know anyone in the food community. I hadn't been hired to do cookbooks and at Knopf, but I knew this book was something I had been longing for, to really understand French cooking. Anyway, so I boldly sent it to the few people that made up the food world then, and one of them was James Beard. And he went right to the phone, and he said, that's a damn good book. And then he said, I wish I'd written it. But what did he do? He said, you've got to give a party, and he called Dion Lucas, who had the what was it, the egg basket, I guess it was called then. And as I say, there weren't many people in the food world, but they all came because James Beard was behind it. And it was about 10 years later, we saw each other over the years and got to know each other better, but he was finishing his American book, and I called him up again and said, you know, with this whole crazy counterculture, everybody's making bread now, and nobody knows how to make bread, and we need a really good teaching book on bread. And he said, well, let's have lunch. So we talked about it, and a few months later, I called him and said, have you been thinking? He said, yep, let's have lunch again. So after he got about 4 good lunches out of me, he said to me, I think I'll do that book. Well, that was just an answer from heaven as far as I was concerned. And you know what he particularly loved about it and respected Julia for was that she opened up cookbooks. She made cookbooks a teaching vehicle. She made you understand what you were doing and why. And Jim grew up in the era when the shorter the recipe, the better. They were so truncated that nothing was explained. So he loved doing this bread book because he really had a very, very analytical mind. And I remember when he did the basic bread, I said, why don't we get some absolute neophytes, people who've never cooked? I'll find half a dozen or so around Knopf. And we'll give them this first recipe and see how their bread comes out. Well, he loved it. And in came 6 loaves of bread, not one looked like the other. And so he wrote a little, I think it was called, oh, I can't remember, but something about suggestions. It was very gentle suggestions if you have made the not quite perfect loaf. And then he described what happened and why, if it was too gummy or if the crust sprang from the bread. It went on for 2.5 pages. And I really do feel that that opened him up in a very important way, because he liked to get close to people who were cooking. He was wonderful in his classes, the way he'd walk around and show somebody how to flip a pancake and use their fingers to turn it if they didn't want the flip. And I think that when he realized that he could do this in books, it really changed his thinking. After the bread book, we did a pasta book. That pasta was all the rage then. There were fresh little pasta shops all over New York. And I used to go down and work with him because he was getting pretty old then, and he always loved to have somebody working with him. And if the telephone rang, he couldn't wait to run to the telephone, and I'd hear him on the phone with some woman in Iowa saying, well, now, dearie, what do you think, what was your oven temperature? And have you had it calibrated? Oh, you don't know about calibrating. It would go on and on. Anything not to get back to work. But work we did. And I remember also his coming home the next day. It was down there, and he'd had a wonderful dinner of pasta the night before, made of grilled swordfish. Now, that wasn't exactly an American, an Italian kind of recipe. But I remember his saying, well, we're Americans and we can do as we please. And also, he was so spontaneously creative himself. He would go to the refrigerator and open the door and sort of stand back and swing on it and see, what have I got in the refrigerator today? I'll make you a nice little da-da-da-da, and it would put it all together in about 15 minutes. I think he always said that it was, of course, his growing up with his mother's love of cooking and cooking for others that influenced him, but there was also a Chinese helper in their household, and they went to Chinese restaurants a lot. And I found this quote, which I thought was quite interesting. He said that only the Chinese had developed that great accuracy of palate, and that to him it was like perfect pitch, and he had it. He also was a fund of knowledge. If I needed help on something, and I remember I did desperately need help because the Fannie Farmer people came to me, and they had tried about 6 publishers to take over the Fannie Farmer cookbooks, because they had become box-top recipe cook. I mean, they just had fallen into a state of disgrace. And I said, I don't want to take it over because it's really not a good cookbook anymore. And that got the Frank Benson, who ran the Fannie Farmer Company, perked right up. And he said, well, what would you do to change it? And I said, well, I'd get somebody who could really be the voice of Fannie Farmer in America today, to go through all those recipes, rework them, talk about things like the microwave, what it did, what it didn't, and so on. He said, we want you to do it. So I was stuck with what my vision, but nobody to perform it. So I said to Jim, you've got to find somebody for me. And he said, I'd like you to read some of these letters. And they were his correspondence with Marion Cunningham, who was a California woman who, in midlife, changed her whole life and went and joined Jim's cooking classes up in Oregon. And he thought that she had that authentic taste, that American taste. She wasn't a writer. She wasn't particularly analytical about why. But he felt that that was the most important thing, that we had to get the real taste back into those recipes. And it worked. I still miss him, I think, almost every day, because there were so many things he could tell me. But fortunately, right after he died, my husband wrote this wonderful biography of him, and I had the pleasure of tagging along and going to interviews and taping what people said about Beard. And those stories were just treasures. Everybody had a story about how he really changed their lives. And I think it was a very powerful thing, and we won't forget him.
Our final panelist is Barbara Kafka. Barbara?
I'm short. If you need to chop, just cut and I'll stop. My experience with James Beard is rather different than the rest of the people here. Perhaps closest to Judith's, but we taught together. And I did the Cook's Catalog, of which he was a nominative editor. And I developed recipes for our cooking classes, and we lived together. We taught at the Stanford Court, and he had his rooms there, a lovely suite, and I had my little room over here. And he would wake me at 6:30 in the morning, my least favorite time of day. And, but we would have breakfast, and we talked, and we went on and on. I'm a difficult person. I get into controversy with all sorts of people. The first time I ever met Jim, we had a fight. Bert Wolfe, who was the owner of the company that put together the Cook's Catalog, took me down to be presented to Mr. Beard as the hopeful new editor. He didn't remember to tell me that I was replacing Josie Wilson, who has been Mr. Beard's writing partner for many years. A touchy subject. Anyhow, we were sitting in his, well, the office moved from upstairs to downstairs. They put in an interior staircase, so what you see today is not quite the same. But in any case, we were sitting downstairs, and we were getting on perfectly fine, and we both got into a thing about how we liked meatloaf and we liked pate, and that they were different. And I made the statement that what I like to use was I like to use leaf lard to line my pate pans with. He said, "You can't do it." "But Mr. Beard, I do it. I take it there." He was a very large man. It was a very impressive presence. And he pounded on the table, and he got up, and he said, "I can't talk to this woman. Absolute nonsense." Went out of the room, went to the hall, which is where the stairs were, to go up to the other part of the house. Literally shaking. And I'm struggling into my coat, and about halfway up the stairs, I hear him turn around, come down, and he said, "I'm sorry, I was in a foul mood today." And we never had another fight. We had disagreements, many of them, but we never had another fight. Now, I think that one of the major elements in the James Beard story has only been slightly alluded to in the prior presentations. Incidentally, I was a founder of the Beard Foundation, not of the Food Channel. Small, tacky, factual things. In any case, gets me in trouble all the time. In any case, there were many people who wrote in America about food in good, direct English, and were very successful. And some who were so influential in American food that we almost don't see it. Certainly Thomas Jefferson was an overwhelming presence in American food. His garden journals have been come out as a book. He promulgated the idea of American wine. He brought rice back, arborio rice, in his pocket illegally from Italy when he was there. And he was very interested in American food and America becoming a food country. But aside from Jefferson, the other notable cooks and cookery writers were women. Now that is the real difference. James Beard came along, and he was a man. And he wrote about grilling outdoors. That's what men do, right? They go out and they make a charcoal fire and they grill. So this was an identity, and it was a very special identity. Jim was also gay, uncompromisingly, directly gay, no apologies about it. And a large part of the food world is gay. This may come as a shock to you.
I beg your pardon.
Do you?
And I love your blouse.
Oh, darling, I thought you'd never mention it. In any case, that's a period voice, incidentally. That is the voice of the gay community in the 60s. I grew up as a ballet dancer, a poet, and a cookery writer. Figure it out. In any case, Jim was uncompromising. And I think that was very important because it meant that he was honest. And he was always honest. He would have hated all the references to cuisine. I mean, he just hated it. Gourmet. He said they're gourmets, those people. He didn't want affectation. His own a little bit, but not affectation. He had enormous presence, an enormous sense of reality, and even when he did advertising, there was something that came through. He wrote with many people. He wrote very little of his own material directly, aside from the Canapé book and the Fireside Cookbook. He worked primarily with women who were English, aside from Judith and Renee Sachs. His mother was English, and I think he was very comfortable with that. What always amazed me, and I knew Jim for quite a few years, before Julia, before all of that, he threw me to the wolves of the culinary establishment in the 50s, I guess. In any case, the books all still sound like Jim. I did recipes. Honest to God, I'm not lying, especially at the end of his life. He was older, he was tireder. He didn't want to stand there and develop and write down recipes. So I did it. I assure you, and I think I'm a very good recipe writer, and I've written a lot of books, and a lot of people like my food. And I think that the food I did for Jim was Jim's food. And there is one example only of his directly crediting a recipe to me. He credited many people, incidentally. But it was a buckwheat pasta, and he asked if he might use it, and I developed it with beer, sort of like blini, to use in his pasta book. 1 minute. And I can't talk any faster. But the food always came out Jim. When we taught at the end of his life, he was feeble, physically feeble. And he used to sit in a tall director's chair and look out over things. And he did not, in fact, I taught, other people taught, okay? We cut, we chopped, we looked over the people, we said, do this, do that. And Jim would intersperse a comment occasionally. I assure you, if you talk to those people today, they would all say to you, oh, I had the most wonderful cooking class with Jim Beard. And in fact, Jim had the same feeling about them. He would call me when I hadn't been doing the class with him, when somebody else had been. And he would say, oh, Barbara, last night we had the best class I've ever had. And if he were here tonight, he would say to you, you're the best class I've ever had. Cook!
I graduated culinary in 1975, January, and I met Mr. Beard in 1975. Can everybody hear me? Okay. He gave the address at our graduation. I think we had 100 students at the time. It was the first year we moved from New Haven, Connecticut to Hyde Park, New York. And he said something which I have never forgotten, and it was stated like this. It went, if you're going to cook something, cook it, and you're going to cook it for whatever you make, whether it be a hamburger or a roast, make it like you're going to make it for royalty, because it's all about you and what you put into it. And it's like, for 30 years, I spent in the back of the kitchen, and I've gone by that, I thought it was terrific. And he was a very, very interesting man to listen to. He spent a lot of time up there with the students. And I worked for Mr. Baum. Joe Baum.
Now that's another set of stories.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to tell you that I was the first team at Windows. I was on the first team at Windows of the world.
Jim was at Windows. Jim and Julia both consulted and went in, and Julia supervised chicken stock.
Can you put the mic?
I was working for Andre Rene at the time. Okay, but you wrote the menu. Didn't you write the menu for Windows?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And,
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
and I told Andre he was cheating.
Did you get that on camera? Any other one wish to make a comment? Well, come up. If you just get in line over here, and brief comments would be appreciated. Okay.
I'm also short. You mentioned that woman from Iowa who called him and who he was nice enough to speak to. I was figuratively one of those women from Iowa. In the early 1970s, a friend of ours, I was living upstate at the time, my wife and I were living upstate, and she and her family were good friends with Jim. And we had a friend who had gone moose hunting in Canada and brought back moose meat for us, and we had no idea what to do with a moose. And my wife said, so call Jim and ask him what to do with the moose. And without hesitation, he said, oh, use Lyndon Johnson's recipe for fish. I had no idea what that was. He said, what you do is you get a board, and he listed a whole bunch of spices. He said, rub the board with the spices and then nail the moose to the board, and you put it in a low oven for about 3 days. Then you take it out of the oven, throw away the moose, and eat the board.
I'm the wife. I'm also the daughter of Joe Baum. So, anyway, I just want to say my name is Hillary Baum. I know several people here and on this panel. And I have many, many fond memories of Jim Beard. And he was a collaborator with my dad for over 30 years. I I have some very youthful pictures of Barbara around big tables at windows and working on menus and many other related projects. And one of the most exciting, I have a couple of very brief things to mention, but one of the most exciting things in my life was actually being in Paris with my parents and Jim Beard at the same time when I was in my early 20s, and had the amazing fortune of going to Les Halles with Jim very early in the morning once, and it made an incredible impression on me. And then one of the last things I did with Jim, and it was right before he died, was I went to visit him, and I had my parents' car outside because I had actually come to take him for a little shopping trip to the Union Square Market. And I had the best time walking around the market with him. He was greeted by everybody. And it was an incredible, moving experience for me to, in a way, have started my adult life with Jim and Leal, and then spending this other time, well into my adulthood in another market setting that has been such a very important market. And I wound up developing a career involved with markets, and a lot of it had to do with Jim. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm very grateful to him, as well as many other related family reasons. So thank you.
My name is Bob Marcelli, and I'm one of those people that Jim encouraged. And he encouraged me so much that it really changed my life. And he did have this incredible sense of humor. I was 33 when I met him, which was 26 years ago. And I'd been in the food business already for probably about 15 years, and I said, I never had any formal training. And I happened to meet him, and I said, I was thinking that I should go to culinary school. And he looked at me and he went, Bob, why would you want to do that? And I went, well, gee, I don't know. The short story is that he invited me to a party at his house that he was giving for Madeline Common. And I walked up to Larry Forgione, and I said, introduced myself, and I said, I'd like to come and work with you. So Larry said, oh, sure, no problem. I'm opening a restaurant in January, so come on. 20 years ago, this month, I cooked my Rising Star Chef dinner right down the street. And that's what Jim did for me, so thank you.
Does anyone have any burning question that you would like to ask publicly? Sure. Steve?
Yeah, I'd like to know what happened to the Galloping Gourmet.
Oh.
What happened to
The
him?
show or the person?
He's
As a
been
person
Boston.
or?
Both. I know.
Well, first he became an alcoholic. And that interrupted his career rather decisively. You don't ask questions when I'm around because I tell the truth. And then he found God in the usual step way.
First, there was an accident.
There was a car
There
accident.
was a terrible accident.
Yes.
Brought on by alcohol.
That too. And he came back on television, was enormously successful again. And I think he was bored, that he had done as much with the medium as he could, and he was very unlike Jim, who was a perfectly lousy television performer. I can tell you from great personal experience. Graham Kerr was a very good television performer, and he was terrific, but he did it in a very athletic way, and it just required a lot of work, and I think, it was time to go home.
He's
Well, no, I think the second round was in the 80s, wasn't it? 90s?
And he's very clearly tried to distance himself from the Galloping Gourmet moment, seeing it as a sort of an
And
unfortunate part of his
just
life.
as
Yeah, but then the second show, was it what, in the 80s? It was in the 80s, and it went on for a couple of years. It was successful.
he's alive and well in Boston, and I received an email from him about a year ago, he has a whole new idea on a television program. So I want to thank everybody that has made this program a success. First, our panelists themselves. Second, I want to thank those that put this program together and really did the work. Pam, tell us, you got to wave your hand, Pam. Come on, raise your hand. Nice and high, come on. And I would like to thank all of you for sharing this experience with me and us, and I think it's been a wonderful time. I've learned a lot, and I thought I knew a lot about James Beard, so thank you very much.
I think we should thank Andrew Smith also, who did a terrific job putting this together.